southwest of Saudi Arabia, in the middle of a lunar landscape, for over 2,000 years, enigmatic dwellings. These rock facades, with finely chiseled lines, seem to have been torn from the chaos of stone. This is the ancient city of Egra, off limits to visitors for several hundred years. These immense tombs carved out of the rock are similar to those of the famous Petra in southern Jordan, the capital of the Nabateans. Between these two cities lie 700 kilometers of desert. But what do we really know about the Nabatean civilization? This people of Caravaneers emerged from the sands of Arabia some 4 centuries BC.
Little is known about the Nabateans, apart from the reports of Diodorus of Sicily and Strabo, 1 or 2 centuries apart, who describe them respectively as a nomadic people who were very attached to their freedom and therefore didn't build houses, lived in the desert and were able to fend for themselves by going from well to well. And then Strabo, 1 or 2 centuries later, tells us that, on the contrary, the Nabateans build houses everywhere, that they have luxurious homes, that they love to get rich.
The Greek authors also say that the Nabateans were
Greek stories also tell us that the Nabateans were adept at escaping and hiding in the desert if attacked. But they were best known for their famous camel caravans, which enabled them to trade over very long distances.
Nabatean caravans, heavily laden with myrtle, incense and spices from India and Arabia, crossed the Hejaz desert from south to north. They supplied the Greek and Roman world with these precious goods, reaching as far as the Mediterranean port of Gaza and the prestigious Alexandria.
Incense was used for cult, for offerings to gods, but also in medicines and in fumigation, because they used it simply to make their houses smell better. So it was in great demand, and the Romans had an almost infinite capacity to consume this incense. The Nabateans, maybe they saw the opportunity, a niche opportunity to take control of these trade routes. This is speculation, really, because we don't know what prompted them to settle down and form a state. But certainly they were immediately very successful. When the Greeks come into contact with the Nabateans in 312 BC, the Nabateans are already known to be very rich because of their success in trade.
These nomadic traders, renowned for the abundance of their goods, soon became the object of much covetousness. To ensure their safety, they chose a natural refuge at the heart of a rugged pink sandstone massif, Petra in Greek. To get there, they had to dare to enter a narrow, winding gorge, bordered by towering cliffs up to 300 meters high, like the towering walls of this impressive natural fortress. It was here that they built their capital. The city of Petra was hidden from view. This unwalled stronghold practiced the art of camouflage so well that it eventually disappeared from human memory at the dawn of the Middle Ages. It was not rediscovered until the early 19th century by a Swiss traveller, Burckhardt, who was the first to travel through the impressive 2-kilometre-long Sika Gorge. He was amazed to see the extraordinary facade of the Rasnay.
It's a bit of a culture shock for us to find extremely sophisticated sculptures in this mountainous rocky site, very similar to and as beautiful as those found in Alexandria, evoking in certain respects Hellenistic Pergamene sculpture, even though we're in the middle of the desert.
Alors qu'on est en plein désert.
Bewitched by the strangeness of the sights, Petra's explorers were initially captivated by the impressive number of tombs carved into the cliffs. As a result, the site was long regarded as a huge necropolis. Yet Petra was more than 2,000 years ago a real city, with its residential quarters, markets, streets, craftsmen's workshops and temples, where the Nabatean gods were honored.
It's a curious and paradoxical site for a city. Not all the resources needed to support a large community are available in this basin. In particular, water supply poses enormous problems.
L'adduction d'eau pose d'énormes problèmes.
The genius of the Nabateans was to exploit the surrounding massifs as an immense rainwater collection basin. As a result, the 92 square kilometers of the site are riddled with hydraulic installations. A network of pipes cut into the rock or masonry leads every drop of rain to cisterns where the water is collected.
Here they showed themselves to be great masters in the art of hydraulics. Perhaps they owed this mastery to their nomadic origins, precisely to the fact that in the desert it's important not to let a drop of water evaporate.
3,000 monuments have been listed on Laila Neme's archaeological map of the Petra site. At its peak, the city must have numbered tens of thousands of inhabitants. It is thanks to these clues that today's archaeologists are trying to piece together the puzzle of Nabatean history. But 170 years of research have brought more questions than certainties. For example, the famous Rasnay that adorns the entrance to the city is still an enigma. Was it the tomb of a king or a temple? When was it carved out of the rock? And what religion did the Nabateans practice to literally cut out this mountain from the heights of Petra, leaving only the upright symbol of God?
Obviously, if we had a history of the Nabatean kingdom, like Josephus' history of the Judean kingdom, which was contemporary with the Nabatean kingdom. But maybe, certainly for me, what would be most valuable and most interesting would be to have some, even a small fragment of the religious literature of the Nabateans. We have the names of gods, we have temples, lots of religious dedications when somebody makes an offering to the gods. But we really don't understand anything about the mythology or the way that people prayed or praised their gods. And even a small fragment of material of this kind, it would be wonderful to have such a thing.
Where to look for new clues? Perhaps on the southern borders of the Nabatean domain, on ancient Egrat, the gateway to their kingdom. today known as Médin Saleh, the place from which the Nabatéan caravans set off over 2,000 years ago and remained untouched for several centuries.
Médin Saleh is a site that has made generations of archaeologists dream, and there are still many who would love to come and work on this site because it is so mythical. It's the site par excellence after Petra because it's Nabatéan par excellence.
But if Médin Saleh is legendary, it's also because a fatwa hangs over the site, a curse that has turned it into forbidden territory. Legend has it that the place was once inhabited by the Tamudéans, a perverse people to whom God sent the Prophet Saleh to bring them back to himself. Unbelieving, the Tamdéans asked him for a sign of his divine mission. To convince them, Saleh performed a miracle. He brought a camel out of the rock. By day, she used the Mabrakanaka Pass to graze on the plain. In the evening, she distributed her milk in abundance to all the inhabitants. But rather than accept this miracle, the Tamudéans decided to get rid of the animal. They fixed daggers in the gorge, disemboweling the camel. She died with a terrible roar. A camel escaped from its side and turned into a rock. Then God's wrath fell on the Tamudans, and they were all destroyed. The Quran echoes this legend, and even today many Muslims avoid the cursed site. They see the high Nabatean facades as the former homes of the Tamdines, the killers of the miraculous camel. As a result, the site remained off-limits for centuries. It wasn't until the very early 20th century that two Dominican fathers belonging to the Jerusalem Bible School rediscovered Médin Saleh. Antonin Jotson and Raphael Savignac were true explorers of the Orient. For years they traveled the Holy Land, Sinai, Jordan and Syria. Josène put to good use his knowledge of ethnology, epigraphy and languages, particularly Arabic, which he taught. Savignac developed his photographic talents to illustrate scientific works. In 1907, they were granted a mission to Arabia by the Société Française des Fouilles Archéologiques. The Hejaz Railroad linking Damascus to the holy cities of Arabia was just completed. The two Dominicans joined the pilgrims heading for Mecca. They were to be the first to rediscover the ancient Egrat. Spending several days on the site, working tirelessly, they produced a work that remains the standard reference for researchers to this day. In it, they describe everything they observed on the site and provide the first photographs of previously unseen remains, which will be the stuff of dreams for generations of archaeologists. 100 years later, it was a French team that was the first to follow in the footsteps of Josène and Savignac. Archaeologist and epigraphist Laila Neme from the CNRS is the mission leader. This is the first time that a foreign team has been authorized by the Saudi government to work on the site. It took several years to prepare and organize the expedition. The multidisciplinary team has only a few weeks to compare the site with the work of Josène and Savignac, and perhaps find new inscriptions and clues. Far from the rugged red cliffs of Petra, the Egrat site stretches across a vast expanse of sand, from which massive yellow sandstones emerge. Most of them are carved with tombs, except for the astonishing Jebel-i Tlib, where a cult area has been identified. It was here that Leila began her exploration, accompanied by topographer Thomas Arnoux.
The criteria for identifying the Nabatean presence in a territory that stretched from Damascus to the Saudi Hijaz are, on the one hand, ceramics, as they are found in abundance on the sites, on the other, architectural representations and representations of divinities, but also, of course, writing. And it's a script, the Nabatean script, found in almost identical forms from Sinai to southern Syria. This script is derived from the Aramaic of the empire, Aramaic as it was used in the chancellery of the Persian Empire, but it very quickly developed its own characteristics that make it immediately recognizable.
Stone-cutting specialist Jean-Claude Bessac, accompanied by archaeologist Nasser Azaid, reaches the Al-Quraima tombs to the west of the site. Unlike Petra, where erosion has profoundly damaged the buildings, Egrat has been miraculously spared the ravages of time. The facades that have sprung up from the rock still bear the fine marks of the stone-cutter's tools.
For example, here on the right we have grooves that are very inclined and fairly widely spaced, while on the left we have almost vertical grooves that are fairly tightly packed. What does this mean? Well, the work was shared between two stonemasons, one working on the right-hand side and the other on the left. What's really surprising is that in the ancient world, this is the only place here in Agra where there are the same number of stonemasons. Moreover, there's a consideration for the craftsman's skill and place in society that doesn't exist elsewhere.
Le savoir-faire de l'artisan et disons la place dans la société de l'artisan qui n'existe pas ailleurs, quoi.
Can you give me the total height of the niche first, please? Yes. In Petra there may be 1 or 2 niches with eagles, but that's it. So it must have been a symbol of power. In Syria it's associated with Barshemite, but here it's a motif that's found quite often. Then there's a kind of garland underneath, you see, underneath the wings with 2 little holes as if they were hanging marks.
Il y a une espèce de guirlande en dessous, tu vois, en dessous des ailes, avec 2 petits trous comme si c'était des traces d'accrochage.
Ah, lui, un petit peu...
Oui.
You can't carve in the rock itself. Technically, it's impossible to start at the bottom and work your way up. Even in the steepest areas, he had to find a natural fault that formed a flat in the mountain to access the summit. The little notches there are always for access from the top. All the more so since, with each section, each horizontal slice, you have to finish and never come back, since you don't have to work out the details. There's not much wood here, so scaffolding is out of the question. This is a tomb where they took a gamble, given the privileged location of this sort of natural sandstone mushroom. They wanted it to be visible from afar and isolated, so it was all the more ostentatious. But they knew they were taking a risk and that they might come across some bad rock. That's why they stopped. It was the bad rock that blocked them, and they stopped work the moment they encountered these bad strata. If they had succeeded, they would have had one of the tombs, not to say the most prominent tomb, in relation to its neighbors, the most visible from afar, the best exposed and above all isolated, so it distinguishes the person who does it.
How did an originally nomadic people manage to build such aesthetically pleasing masterpieces? On this question, archaeologists seem to agree. The Nabateans appropriated certain decorative elements from the cultures of their neighbors, as evidenced by the tomb facades. A layered decor, freely combining Egyptian cornices, Mesopotamian merlons, doors and pilasters from the Greco-Roman world.
We brought in highly skilled people, trained in the major cultural centers of the Mediterranean East. It's also conceivable that local teams could be trained to copy, either on site or by bringing them in from abroad. In Alexandria or Asia Minor, especially in the Alexandrian field, and teach them how to work. In fact, when you look closely, there are some pieces that are exceptionally technical and others that are a little, well, skewed. You can't see it from a distance, but you can see it up close.
Jacqueline Denzer, a decor specialist, is discovering new elements thanks to the state of preservation of the facades.
When you get closer to the facades, you notice that many of them have traces of plaster. All the protruding parts of the decor were probably plastered and painted in bright colors. You can see white, blue and red. In other words, the contrast was very strong when seen from afar. The superimposed planes were even more noticeable. The purpose of all this was ostentation, to show the power, wealth, and might of the dead man's family.
These monumental tombs were therefore reserved for the great Nabatean families of Egrat. However, on the surrounding peaks, another team, led by Isabelle Sachet, has just located simple rectangular holes dug into the rock. These were burials for inhabitants who could not afford larger ones. Inside the monumental tombs, niches were dug into the walls, loculi in Greek, house the bodies of the deceased. In this family vault, one of the largest in Egrat, there are 29 grave spaces, including some smaller ones for children. Since ancient times, the tombs have been plundered, nothing remains, except for a few inscriptions that provide valuable information. They mention that Uchabu reserved this place for himself, his two sons, his mother, his sisters, and their children. We also learn that this Nabatean was originally from Taima, 200 kilometers away.
There are 40 or so long tomb inscriptions, and several of these tomb inscriptions were made by women, and they say things like, one of the women is called Kam Kam, and she says that this is the tomb which Kam Kam made for herself and for her daughter and for her grandchildren. It's clear that women were making tombs, had the power to buy the property and to commission a mason to make a tomb in their own name, and then they would set up an inscription which made it clear that it was their own property. And these are legalized inscriptions, or legalistic inscriptions, which give rules about who can and who cannot be buried in the tomb. And it's clear that sometimes only women could be buried in particular tombs. So this implies that women had maybe more role than you would quite expect.
That's what we're looking for. You see, in this one there are two batiles and not just one. So the batiles represented divinity. For the Nabateans, it's in the form of a simple stone called aniconic, because there's no figurative representation on it. So it's not sculpture with faces and so on. And so each of the batiles represents a divinity. So when there are two in a niche, it's probably because they represent two deities.
These are essentially stone blocks, and in northwest Arabia at this time there was a tradition of representing deities as plain stone blocks. There was a kind of inhibition against representing a god as a statue. It wasn't a kind of religious taboo, but it was a reluctance on the part of the Nabateans to represent gods as statues. This reluctance, of course, became a rule later sector in Islam.
Look, Thomas, this time you've got three. A large one flanked by two smaller ones. We always tend to say that the one in the middle, the larger one, will be Duchara, who is the main god of the Nabateans, who has a bit of a dynastic god vocation. And then we can imagine that the two lateral batiles are what we call the Paradris, i.e. the gods associated with Dushara. In this case, there's no way of knowing whether the one in the middle and those on the sides are male or female deities. But we do know from the inscriptions that there were female deities among the Nabateans. One in particular, named El Huza, is often depicted with eyes and a nose in the middle of the batile.
The goddess Al-Uzza, her name is an Arabic form name, and it means the mighty one, the mightiest one. And she apparently represented the planet Venus, so she is an astral goddess. She's sometimes in inscriptions equated with the Greek goddess Aphrodite. There are a number of other deities, and there is no systematic pantheon. There is no source that we have that tells us how they're all related to each other.
Le dessin des niches dépendait surtout du goût de type qui la faisait tailler et puis de son porte-monnaie aussi. Parce qu'une petite niche comme celle qui est à côté là, qui est beaucoup plus simple, coûtait moins cher à faire.
The design of the niches depended above all on taste, on the man who had it carved and on his wallet too, because a small niche like the one next to it, which is much simpler, cost less to make than this one. These two inscriptions refer to the stonemasons who probably carved the two adjacent niches, and there's the name of the guy called Rabed Malku, who says he's a sculptor, or sculptor, stonecutter, the term is a bit generic, and Shalom, which is may he be holy and safe. So it's really a greeting from the sculptor who leaves his signature to say that he is the author of the two niches next to it.
Comme on voit les graffitis dans les rues actuellement, c'est l'équivalent antique des graffitis modernes que l'on trouve dans les villes. Et le 10% restant étant essentiellement soit des épitaphes, donc des inscriptions qui donnent le nom des défunts, ou bien des dédicaces religieuses qui disent
the Nabatean corpus comprises some 5,000 texts, 90% of which are signatures, in other words. Simple graffiti by people who leave their signatures on the rock, just as we see graffiti in the streets today. It's the ancient equivalent of modern graffiti found in cities. And the remaining 10% are essentially either epitaphs, i.e. inscriptions giving the names of the deceased, or religious dedications saying that this is the batile of such and such a deity made by such and such a son of such and such.
In fact, this tomb was abandoned at this stage because one of the merlons, the stone steps on either side of the tomb at the top, broke off here and they had to abandon it. This just goes to show the difficulty of this type of rock work, where you can't change the stones. Once it's broken and the work is abandoned. It's very simple to extract the blocks as you go along, but it does require a certain amount of technical skill. The quarryman digs this trench to the required depth. Once the block is encircled, as you can see, he digs interlocking joints at the base. These are holes in which wedges, iron wedges, are placed. It's the pressure of these wedges that loosens the blocks, and then these blocks are rushed down onto piles of sand to prevent them from breaking, so that they can be recovered.
C'est très simple, mais ça demande tout de même une certaine technicité. Il y a une jambe qui est à l'extérieur, comme ici donc, et une jambe à l'intérieur, et le carrier creuse cette tranchée jusqu'à la profondeur souhaitée. Une fois le bloc cerné, comme on les voit, il creuse à la base des emboîtures. On appelle des emboîtures, ce sont des trous dans lesquels on place des coins de fer, et c'est la pression de ces coins qui décolle ces blocs, et ensuite ces blocs.
If Nabatean tombs were also used as quarries, then what became of all those blocks of stone? This haunting question has prompted archaeologists to search for traces of built structures. Magnetometric prospecting was used to map the subsoil. It revealed the existence of a veritable urban fabric. the residential area of Aigra. A city lies buried beneath the sand, waiting to be awakened. The French team spotted part of the city and what could even be a rampart. Unfortunately, their enthusiasm is short-lived. The team is not yet authorized to excavate. It was the Saudis who carried out the first soundings at the presumed site of the ancient settlement. Once again, the results raised more questions than certainties.
They didn't even understand, because in my opinion, if the town is there, it's closer to the wells. They're all in the western part of the site.
But one thing's for sure, over 2,000 years ago, the town of Higra was a verdant oasis.
Josène and Savignac, the Dominican fathers who visited the site at the beginning of the 20th century, found the wells in operation, with the water table less than 10 meters away. Today, however, all these wells have dried up, and you have to imagine that between antiquity and the early 20th century, the water table dropped. As a result, the Abbatian wells, which are dug at depths of over 15 or 20 meters, sometimes you can barely see the bottom of them, were able to capture water very easily and provide a very comfortable water supply for a city of this size.
According to the scientists' estimates, the residential area would extend over some 50 hectares, within a site of around 500 hectares.
There's a sort of mixture on this site of activities that are linked to the land and activities that are undoubtedly imposed by something other than the land, which could be called Nabatean culture. Indeed, as soon as they have rocks, they use them either to make tombs or to create these open-air cult spaces, as we see inside Jebel Iqlib. And there's a desire to ensure, to mark a presence that is the presence of these great Nabatean families who made all these tombs and for whom we return to forms of culture that were fundamentally developed in Petra.
Look at Thomas, you can see the groove in the canal.
The Nabateans went so far in asserting their culture that they repeated Petra's water collection techniques in these mountain ranges, with these pipes cut into the rock and these cisterns to collect rainwater. Whereas here, it rains much less than in Petra, and the Médin Salé oasis has never been short of water. Perhaps these cisterns had another function. Were they used for religious purposes?
Look, it's a large hall, a banqueting hall. Here it's called the Devoin, but that's just a local toponym. And it's called a triclinium, meaning a hall with 3 benches, trictoire, and kline, which means bench in Greek. And this is where the Nabateans gathered with musicians and drank wine to banquet, either in honor of the gods, or in honor of a king, or in honor of the dead, when associated with the dead. So you see, look, there's a little access with stairs on it. And then, thanks to a large bench, you have to imagine that they were lying across and putting the dishes on the little ledge there. You see, there's a ledge. So they were lying on top of the benches, then they put the dishes down and ate. So it's typical of Nabatean installations. And in Médin Salé, there's only one, which is this one. All the people who came to worship gathered here. There was only one large banquet hall. In Petra, for example, there are 120. It's not the same system at all, yeah. It's not the same system at all. Here, there's a big one, so maybe it's been rented out, a bit like the village hall. It's been rented out on certain occasions by certain brotherhoods. What we have in Petra, however, is a number of banquet banquet halls like this one, where all the guests at the banquet left their signatures on the walls, you have to imagine that there was movement, that the banquet hall was not necessarily always used by the same family.
Participants in these feasts washed in basins placed at the entrance. Inside the triclinium, 13 guests were seated. It is said that the Nabatean king himself served his guests during official banquets, a hospitality ritual still practiced today among the Benue tribes.
Have a look, see that? It's a magnificent inscription. There are two completely different things. There's a Nabatean inscription. And then next to it, probably a North Arabic inscription.
L'écriture nabatéenne a connu
the Nabatean script has had, I would say, a prestigious posterity, since it is very likely to have given birth to, or been at the origin of, the Arabic script as we know it today. Before this date, before 512, the date of the first inscription, Arabic as a language was not written in its own script. It was written in borrowed scripts, including Nabatean. And Nabatean underwent a development from the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries onwards that enables us to see very clearly the evolution of the characters taken one by one towards Arabic characters. That this should be commemorated, then no doubt for the better. If it's a silly head, for Zaidu, who is a son of them, with a Jim Gadjonse mien, with beautiful ligatures, now that's rare. You see, a ligature where the noun should be just like that, but in fact, the guy like that must be the carrier who did it. He must have done... I think these inscriptions were made by the quarrymen who worked here.
Des ligatures où il a le noun devrait être simplement comme ça, et en fait le type, comme ça doit être le carrier qui a dû faire ça, il a dû faire.
And that's why it's a nice size. It doesn't look at all like the graffiti we've seen elsewhere, which are stenciled ugly. Here it's been done with a tool, and he's made ligatures all over it. Normally, this expression is followed by the name of the deity, so we often get Dushara, whereas here, it's obviously something else. For example, Shin, Mem, Yod would be the heavens. This trait is not essential, and Kedam, devant. So, is there a god of the heavens in Nabathene? It's the first time we've seen it.
Alors, est-ce qu'il y a un dieu des cieux en Nabathène? C'est la première fois qu'on le voit.
I've got a theory that in practice what was happening in Nabatean religion was that they were moving towards a kind of monotheism. They did worship other gods, but gradually the other gods were becoming less and less important, and Dushara becomes the supreme god.
This is one of the largest Nabatean inscriptions on the site. Apart from the tomb inscriptions, it's magnificent.
Non, c'est une des plus grandes inscriptions nabatéennes du site, à part celle des tombeaux.
So what does it say? It says Baladekir, may it be commemorated, Abdurabdat, and a guy called Raidu, and another name, Odemos, who are both Asartagaya, i.e. strategists, and a guy called Raidu, and another name, Odemos, who are both Asartagaya, i.e. strategists.
Igrat's inscriptions reveal the titles of high-ranking figures such as strategists. These men sought to manage and protect caravan traffic. At its height, the Nabatean kingdom was a veritable trading empire, encompassing northern Saudi Arabia, southern Jordan, Sinai, and the Negev. This vast territory made up of caravan routes required a sophisticated administration, with the royal power installed in Petra at the summit. Beyond the well-preserved rock buildings, the power of this royal power is also evident in the center of Petra, where traces of large buildings bear witness to an architectural program worthy of the great Hellenized cities. Au-delà des bâtiments rupestres bien conservés, la puissance de ce pouvoir royal apparaît également au centre de l'agglomération de Petra, où les traces de grands édifices témoignent d'un programme architectural digne des grandes cités hellénisées.
De ce Petra central monumental,
this monumental central Petras gives the impression of a very comfortable people who didn't shy away from spending large sums of money to build grand public and religious edifices. This initiative is no doubt due to 2 or 3 successive Nabatean rulers who insisted on this aspect. Perhaps it was purely political. Was it also a question of federating or uniting the various components of a population whose ethnic or cultural origins we have little grasp of?
Les origines ethniques ou culturelles.
Is the famous Rasni at the entrance to the town the signature of a king? Until very recently, it raised more questions than answers.
Actually, there are more than 20 theories about dating of this facade and about the function of this facade. Some archaeologists say that this is actually a tomb. The other they say this is a temple. Some they say no, this is from the 1st century BC. The other they say no, this is from the 1st century AD. Some they say this is Nabatean, the other they say this is Roman. So that is why we decided actually to excavate in front of it to know exactly what is this monument.
Jordanian archaeologists uncovered several tombs similar to those at Egrat, buried at the foot of the Rasna. To construct the immense building, the Nabateans had to reorganize the space, cutting off the top of the facades and condemning some of the tombs to create access to the Rasne.
Mais les sépultures initiales restaient malgré tout accessibles par un escalier.
But the original tombs were still accessible via a staircase. Thanks to an interior layout, it was possible to go from one to the other via the burial chamber. Such arrangements would confirm that these were indeed royal tombs, and that the Rasne was the funerary temple erected to the glory of the reigning dynasty. Thus, the inhabitants of Petra could visit the tombs and honor the royal family.
بعد ما جهزوا كان الناس يفوتوا من هناك من برا وفتحوا الباب هذا عشان يزوروا.
والنافذة انه كانت للإضاءة وللأكسجين.
Ainsi, les habitants de Petra pouvaient visiter les tombes et y honorer la famille royale. La mise au jour de ces vestiges et la découverte de
the excavation of these remains and the discovery of ceramics and lamps date the building to the 1st century BC during the reign of Aretas IV. 700 kilometers away, the Ayla picks up a small object from the sand over 2,000 years old, which suddenly brings the Nabatean sovereign back into the light. A coin. Today, these silver and bronze coins are the only way of knowing the faces of the Nabatean kings and the chronology of their reigns. The presence of the queen on some of them also testifies to the importance of the status of women in this civilization.
After
3 weeks of investigation, the archaeological mission comes to an end. Lila is forced to leave the site. She takes with her new evidence, but also leaves many questions unanswered, the most obvious of which is, who is this city hidden beneath the sands?
It's amazing with this old map of 1907 from Josin Savignac that we haven't had anything better to work with until relatively recently. So on the old map, are there new archaeological features which you've been able to identify?
Yes, quite a lot, especially in the Jebel Idlib area and also in the so-called residential area where all the city wall which goes around it is now visible, and so it was built of mud brick.
And also the Nabatean inscriptions, we have been able to locate all the ones which are not carved on the facades of the tombs. I think now that the residential area included the city was about 50 hectares, between 50 and 60. But we don't really know whether the whole area was inhabited or...
From this uncertain Nabatean history, one truth emerges in 106 AD. The walls of Sikh, which had protected access to Petra for centuries, were powerless to hold back Emperor Trajan's Roman legions. The Nabatean kingdom became a Roman province.
Well, the usual assumption is that they did give up easily. There is no evidence of any great struggle when the Romans took over the state in 106 AD. But this assumption is a little bit based upon kind of prejudices that we have. I have a research student who is interested in the way that, and he's an Arab in fact, he's interested in the way that the history of events like this is written by the conquerors. And according to the history written by the conquerors, this was a peaceful liberation which took place when the Romans took over Nabatea. It's not entirely believable that it was so peaceful, and there is very little evidence, but at least we ought to be aware of the fact that the only evidence we have is the Roman evidence, the Roman version of events.
The powerful presence of the Roman Empire remodeled Petra. With its colonnaded streets and refurbished buildings, Rome's imprint disguised what had been Nabatean. The French team that has been excavating the famous Kazal Bind for several years is at the heart of this problem. The great Nabatean temple, dedicated to Dushara, reveals a very carefully constructed sandstone building, clad in stucco. It even had an anti-seismic device made of juniper beams, which is why a large part of the building is still standing. After several earthquakes destroyed the whole of downtown Petra in the 4th century AD, the Nabatean elements were able to take control, but the Nabatean elements have been replaced by Roman traces, which are now emerging from the excavations.
Now that you've laid it out, we can finally admire it. It resembles Marco Aurel's literate Roman, and by contrast, those on the first head are reminiscent of Lucius Verus, all in agreement.
The Marco Aurel emperor's face, finely sculpted in marble, is similar to another element of a statue found a few years earlier on the site, which seems to have the features of Lucius Verus. These two sons of Antoninus were imperial correctors between 161 and 169. Their discovery allows us to date the Roman monument that was superimposed on the Nabatean enclosure.
It must have been huge. It must have been 4 meters 50.
After these events in 106 AD, the Nabateans continued to exist. They didn't disappear. And indeed, we've got instances later in the 2nd century when an individual calls himself a Nabatean. People were still calling themselves Nabatean even after their state had disappeared. So one can imagine the situation of a dispossessed people who still were conscious of their own noble history and tradition. Maybe they even had some hope of a restoration of their kingdom, but no real effort was ever made to restore the kingdom.
A carved tomb bears witness to a form of survival of the Nabatean style after the Roman conquest, thanks to an inscription. This is one of the only inscriptions found in Petra that can be used to date the monument and identify the deceased. The deceased was not a Nabatean, but a Roman. Sextius Florentinus, governor of the province of Arabia, died in 129 AD. Impressed by the rock culture of these masters of the desert, the Roman governor had his tomb carved exactly to his own specifications. For all eternity, he saw himself as the equal of the Nabatean monarchs, of those men who knew how to make intelligible the lines of force that ran beneath the folded surface of the rock.